Good morning. Boker Tov, Shabbat Tov.
Welcome back, everybody. So this is not our final share before Rosh Hashanah.
There will be a share next week, but this will be our final share on Bishul before Rosh Hashanah. Next week we will be discussing Rosh Hashanah, that time of year. So special share in honor of Rosh Hashanah next week. I think we'll talk about what it means Be'er Satan amongst other things. So stay tuned for that and bring your friends. And the following week is Tzom Gedalia, hard to believe, but the following Sunday will be Tzom Gedalia, and if we can, we will have a shir B'ezrat Hashem talking about Yom Kippur. Okay, so we are on Hilchot Bishul. We've been discussing for a number of weeks. Last week we spoke about, going to the definitions, Kli Rishon, Kli Sheni, we didn't get to Kli Shlishi yet, that will be today, but we spoke about Kli Rishon. We spoke about the difference between a Kli Rishon, which is on the fire, and which is off the fire. Again, all that we're talking about, whether it's a Kli Rishon, Kli Sheni, Kli Shlishi, only in a case where we have a temperature of Yad Soledet Bo. If it's not Yad Soledet Bo, if it's cold, so then no cooking is going to take place, unless it's on the fire. But so a Kli Rishon, even when it's still Yad Soledet Bo, even if it's off the fire, we say still cooks, we discussed, we've got the right, the Rabbanan, etc. We spoke about the difference between a Kli Rishon and a Kli Sheni. We spoke a little bit about the Ragush, which is a chumrah, but we are machmir for it, generally speaking. We have a solid chunk of food that is still boiling hot, that's on your plate, it's a Kli Sheni, Kli Shlishi, whatever, we still say it cooks, but if we have other lenient factors to add together, we would take those into account, and that is why Rav Moshe said you could pour ketchup onto your plate, and when it's a Kli Sheni. And then we spoke a little bit about Iroi, which is where you're
pouring from a Kli Rishon.
Do I judge that as the Kli Rishon from where it came from? There was such an opinion. Or do I judge it as the Kli Sheni where it's going to? There was such an opinion. Or do I say it's neither this nor that, but it's
between where it cooks the outer layer? Okay,
that was regarding the Roy, and that was where we got up to last week. So let's pick it up now. We're on page 36. We're talking about Kli Sheni. Kli Rishon, as we say, Kli Rishon cooks. We know that according to everybody. Kli Sheni does not cook. The Gemara said,
put food back on the hot plate, etc.
so then one of our primary concerns is going to be mifzik and mashal, when something looks like cooking. That's why there are those that are lenient to put food directly, solid food, put it directly onto the hot plate, because there are those who say, Rabbi Vadia and others, that you don't cook on a hot plate. A hot plate is there in order to plata shel Shabbat. What very name, right? Plata shel Shabbat, a Shabbos hot plate. Everybody knows you can't cook on Shabbos. You heat it up, you heat up the food. So therefore, says Rabbi Vadia, it's not. It doesn't look like cooking. Everybody knows you're not cooking. You're just heating up, and therefore you could put directly on. Others say no. You need to have a hefsek. We'll get to that later on. But that is the principle of mixzik and basham. So here you see, page 36 at the bottom. We're in source number 27. This Mishnah, which we've already seen, it's a fundamental Mishnah when it comes to the laws of cooking on Shabbat. It says, Kol Shabbat b'chamin me'erev Shabbat, shorin oto b'chamin b'Shabbat. Anything which was placed in hot water before Shabbat can be placed in hot water on Shabbat. In other words, it's already been cooked. You can cook it again because you're not actually cooking, it's already cooked on Shabbat. We discussed two shirim ago, Bishul HaChabut. Now, anything which was not placed in hot water before Shabbat, i.e., it was not cooked, you can medichin we generally take to mean rinsing, but here we're talking about hot water. So you're rinsing it, you're pouring hot water over it on Shabbat. So it sounds like the Mishnah is saying that we can pour boiling water over food which is uncooked. Okay, we'll explain in a moment. Except for certain types of fish, The way these types of fish, Moshe told us recently that they still have this fish. Apparently, if you go to Holland, you can get this fish, where they just pour hot water over it, and that is the way that they cook it. So there's no discussion. Kli Rishon, uptazing to some, uptazing to others. Kli Rishon, Kli Sheni, etc. That is the way that you cook the fish, so that would be forbidden. Okay, but what do we see from here? We see that you can pour boiling water onto the food, and that's not considered cooking. So the question is, hang on a second. We said the last thing we discussed was irui. So we said if irui from a kli, according to the opinion that irui from a kli rishon, pouring from the first, right, from a kli rishon is considered like kli rishon, that would be cooking, and therefore it seems very strange why the Mishnah would allow this. So Tosfot says, Tosfot in source number 28, he says Kol Sheba. He says the Perush Rashbam the irui kli sheni ati shapi. If we go according to the opinion that irui, that pouring is like the kli sheni, like the thing which you're pouring it on towards, so then I understand. This is like putting something in a kli sheni. And a kli sheni, we said, does not cook. You're not placing it in the kli rishon, you're pouring it, that's irui, and that's like a kli sheni that we said doesn't cook. That's according to the way Rashbam learned. Aval, now in both, the Perush Rabbeinu Tam, the Mfalesh the Irui Abed Kikli Rishon. Rabbeinu Tam, on the other hand, says no. He says, page source 28 to top of page 37. He says, Rabbeinu Tam says Irui is like a Kli Rishon. So it says, if I'm now taking this uncooked food, I'm placing it in a Kli Rishon, that's cooking. So how is that allowed? Al Kochach, you therefore have to say, Medichin oton mikli sheni kama, v'imken ma'ayil medichin afilu sholin nami. So says Tosfot, the only way, according to Rabbeinu Tam's understanding, the only way I can read this Mishnah is that I'm pouring this hot water from a kli sheni, because if it was from a kli rishon, it would be cooking, and that would be forbidden. If I'm pouring from a kli sheni, and we know that a kli sheni cannot cook, so then why does the Mishnah teach me you can pour from a kli sheni? Why doesn't it just teach me you can place it in a kli sheni? What's an easier way to cook? You're going to pour the hot, again, not the Dutch fish, but you're going to pour the hot water on, or you're just going to put it in the pot. Much easier to put it in the pot. So the fact that the Mishnah teaches you can pour, but doesn't say that you can put it in, seems to imply, possibly, that there would, even though it's a kli sheni, it would still be forbidden to put it in the kli sheni on Shabbat, right? But we know that that doesn't cook, so how can that be? So here Tosfot offers two resolutions. Source number 29 is the continuation of Tosfot. It says, Omeri, Diafilu b'kli sheni ein sholin, do'ir da'amayim chamin michzikim b'shel. Those are the two magic words. It says Tosfot over here, again, all of this is only a question according to Rabbeinu Tam. According to Rashbam, we're talking about Irui Kli Rishon, we understand that's fine. But according to this, he says it must be. So answer number one is that even in a Kli Sheni, you can't put the food inside. Because yes, I know a Kli Sheni doesn't cook, but it looks like cooking. People see that you're putting food into a pot. What are they going to think you do? Right? I don't know that it's a Kli Rishon, it's a Kli Sheni. You're putting food into a pot, you're cooking on Shabbos. It looks like you're cooking on Shabbos. And therefore that would be forbidden. We have a Mishnah which tells us that you can put spices into not the part which is the kli rishon, but into the kli sheni, whatever. You can pour the spices into the food. Okay, everybody knows you're not just that doesn't look like cooking. You pour in spices. Yes, you pour spices when you cook, but you have the food. You have the food on your plate. You add a bit of salt. You add a bit of pepper, whatever. Take your spice of choice. That is not considered cooking. That I don't think. But if you take food and put it into a pot, everybody's going to think that you're cooking. Therefore, that would be forbidden. He says, "Be'etinami." Alternatively, you could read the Mishnah differently. You could say, "Din sholinoto kevan da'ayev b'kli sheni adnakat malichin." He says, "Einachinami." When the Mishnah says you can pour it on, it says you could put it inside as well. So why does it say you can just pour? It says because the continuation of the Mishnah, the kulyas ispanin, this fish, that there wants to teach you the chumrah that they even to pour you aren't allowed to, because that's the way that you cook the fish. You could, in theory, have placed it inside the pot of kli sheni. But what comes out, according to the first resolution of Tosfot, we see that there is a concept of michzikim vashel, that placing food into a kli sheni, if it looks like cooking, that's going to be forbidden. So we see here that again, Abraham, source number 30, he says, "Asur l'shruto afilu b'kli sheni, the michzi kimevashal." Looks like you are cooking. Turn over the page. Right, the Eglei Tal. Before the Eglei Tal, we have the Orchot Shabbat, which is a contemporary sefer in Orchot Shabbat. We quoted many times in the Shiurim. He gives us a bit of a summary, practically speaking, of some of these dinim. Where do we encounter this? So he says, "Ein litein machal bilti mevashal b'kli sheni shayad soledet." It's always shayad soledet. Again, if you have a kli sheni which is cold, that's not a kli sheni. That's nothing. That's fine. But if it's a kli sheni which is still warm, right? Yad soledet, as we've said, is somewhere between 40 degrees and 70 degrees Celsius, whatever it is Fahrenheit. You can, but from 40 we're going to be. Yeah. He says you can't place uncooked food there. Even though on a doraita level it doesn't cook. This is a din d'Rabbanan that you can't place uncooked food there. It looks like you're cooking. Now, if it's clear and it does not look like cooking, so then you could place it inside. And the example of that is tavlin and different spices. Okay, again, we're talking about spices which are, in the kli sheni, that would be fine. Okay, it's a case which might come up if you're placing a lemon inside a cup of tea, right? So long as it's kli sheni and onwards. We'll see later on a little bit more discussion about the lemon. But in terms of this concern, everybody knows you're not trying to cook the lemon, you're just trying to give a bit of taste to the tea, and that would be okay in that sense. Now, yeah.
Don't put something in the thing. How do you know how happy it is? How do you know what's involved in their way? There's no big sign that says you have to rest.
Yeah.
How do you know? But it always be
Well, again, so part of the problem is we don't know what the answer is. We don't know exactly. We obviously can't measure the temperature of the water in Shabbat. I think if it's cold, if it's if it's lukewarm, you'll know. If it's you're saying from the concern of michzik and mashal. I would say probably like this. We're not going to say. Remember, this is all like Gzerah D'Rabbanan. We're not going to say Gzerah D'Rabbanan. We don't say Muslim Gzerah Gzerah. In other words, the Gzerah D'Rabbanan is don't put food in the kli sheni because you might come put food in the kli rishon, right? So we're not going to say don't put food in a kli sheni that's not actually a kli sheni because then you might come to put food in a kli sheni which is a kli sheni and then you might come to put food in a kli rishon. I would say yeah.
definitely the answer could be to take the thing away
You would think you would think that, but it doesn't always work that way in halakha. I'll give you another example. How big is a kazayik? Kazayik means it's the size of an olive, right? According to most poskim, a kazayik is far bigger than the size of an olive. Okay, there are those because for that reason. Look, Chazal gave us these. We have these measurements. Because this is meant to be more intuitive. It's meant to be so that we know, right? Yatzaleb was something that you can tell, like a kazayit, the gonim, right? That the reason we have our measurements and the size of kazayit, kabetza, etc., because those are things that people know, and those are things that people can recognize and know exactly what the size is. Nonetheless, it doesn't seem to be the way that we interpret it today. Yeah. Shalom.
And then it's like not to make a food, it's to make it good.
I don't know that. What's the question? John looks around the top, okay. Right.
And then
asking if you can add water. Are you asking if you can add water? You want to add boiling water to the toilet? Put it this way, if it's
probably a goose.
Yeah. No, but it's not from.
The solid is cooked.
Again,
It's dry. I need this water. We'll do this. It comes up. You go to the oven. You pour it into the container. Pour the other stuff.
so again, so over here, so your concern here is not about the cliche need, because you're not cooking the water. The water's already cooked. So the question is whether you're cooking the chocolate, which is already cooked. So I would say, so assuming that, if the liquid is already cooked, the question is going to depend on a number of factors. It's going to depend on if I'm taking water, which is not, here you're asking the opposite question of what we're dealing with, right? Because I'm saying I'm not cooking the water. The water's already cooked. I'm taking the water directly from the urn, and I want to put that on. In terms of the water itself, that shouldn't be an issue. The only question would be, what's that going to do to the tron? If the tron's already fully cooked, seemingly it should be permitted. Well, but let's come back there. Let's hold that thought. Let's go back. Let's just so we're dealing with that with our cliche where we are. And what we've said is that pouring into the cliche, right? That we aren't going to allow because of michzik and bashar. Okay, there is a second case. There's a second time where we are going to be concerned about cliche, and this is going to be more serious than the first one. What we've said until now is a case whereby we're concerned that although the cliche is not cooking, it looks like cooking. Michzik and bashar. Okay, and that is going to be again the Rabbanan. But there are cases now. If we go back to our Mishnah we saw in source number 27. Okay, and the Mishnah tells us at the end, it said, Rashi now, on page 39, Rashi in source number 33 tells us, he says, okay, this is getting more appetizing by the moment. It says, Shem dag, this is a type of fish, which is eaten very, very salty. You pour hot water on it. So these types of food, even to rinse them much like you cannot. Right? This is the way that it's cooking, meaning this is an activity which normally, certainly according to the opinion where we saw it, pouring from a cliche, this is an activity which normally does not cook, but certain foods are going to cook in this way, and this is what becomes known as kalei abishul, meaning that there are certain foods which cook very, very easily. Okay? We're going to have a very, very hard time defining what is and what isn't included in kalei abishul. But the Shulchan Aruch over here in source number 34, he says, something which is dry, which has not been cooked before Shabbat. We wouldn't place it in water before Shabbat. These foods, and that's what he says, they don't require a large amount of cooking, just a little bit. It's going to do enough. That just rinsing them with hot water, pouring this hot water, that's going to be enough. That is going to cook them. And therefore, what we're going to see from here is that this is there's a concept of kalei bishul. In other words, when we say kli sheni and you cannot cook in a kli sheni, that is ordinary foods. But there are certain foods that will cook, even if just require a little bit, that will cook in a kli sheni. So now the question is going to be, which foods are those? Where do I have to be? How stringent do we have to be? The Gemara has a discussion about salt. Okay, have a look at source number 36. I'll just preface that this is not the salt that we have nowadays. The salt that we use nowadays is generally speaking cooked. Right, by the time it gets to us, either cooked or it's been dried out. We'll see in a moment, but regular table salt. But here the Gemara asks the following question. Source number 36. Tesavar of Yosef Lamema, melach hareu ketavlin. Remember, we said tavlinim, spices, you can put it not in a kli rishon, but you can put them in a kli sheni. Because there we say they don't cook. So Savar of Yosef Lamema, melach hareu ketavlin, he held that salt is like other spices. The kli rishon shela b'kli sheni lo b'shela. In a kli rishon it will get cooked, but in a kli sheni it won't get cooked. Amar le'Abaye Tani Rabbi Chia, Melach ena ketavlin. Salt is not like, he says, not the same. The bekli sheni nami b'sheila. In other words, according to the two versions in the Gemara, first version, he says, yeah, salt is different. He says, salt, even in a kli sheni, could get cooked. According to this, that means that it would be like kalei b'shul. The Gemara continues, and it says, Ika Amri, top of page 41. Ika Amri savar Yosef lemeima melach hareu ketavlin. The bekli rishon b'shela, bekli sheni b'shela. Lo b'shela, right? The hava mina here is the same in both versions. But then Amar le'Abaye Tani Rabbi Chia, melach eina ketavlin. The bekli rishon nami lo b'shela. According to the first version of the Gemara, we say that salt, an uncooked salt, in a kli sheni, would get cooked, right? Here we're saying even in a kli rishon, it would not get cooked. It takes a long time; it's more difficult to cook, and therefore salt would be different. So the question is, what can you do with the salt? How do we view it? The Shulchan Aruch Ariyan, number 31, says melach mutar litein letocho kevan sheviu ma'alash v'tzicha mincha bishura kevisodatua. So the Shulchan Aruch passes like the second version. In other words, that salt is different. Salt takes a very, very, very long time to cook, and salt is an exception that would not. Spoke about kalei b'shul, and we call this chumrei b'shul, right? That would not get cooked even in a kli rishon. However, there are those that are more stringent. That's the Raman, source number 38. He says, "Yesh oslin latet melach afilu bekli sheni kozman shayat zolet bo v'machmir tavo alav bracha." There are those who are stringent, who are concerned that maybe even in a kli sheni, salt could get cooked. Again, what you see from all of this. This is generally speaking not so relevant for us nowadays because salt, you see footnote number 21, is generally, that's already considered cooked, and then that would not be a problem adding salt to your soup or whatever it is. But there's a concept that there could be a food that even in a kli sheni, we're going to get to tea in a moment, you'll see that tea maybe is considered kalei b'shul. Kalei b'shul means that it would cook even in a kli sheni. So just to summarize until this point, we said a kli rishon always cooks, so long as it's hot. A kli sheni doesn't cook. However, we are concerned with kli sheni for the following reasons. Number one, we're concerned for michzik and bashal. So if you're putting food in a kli sheni, it's in a way that appears like cooking. That would be an isur, d'Rabbanan. But more so, we're concerned that we now have a concept of kalei b'shul, that there are, although the general rule is kli sheni does not cook, there are certain foods that cook very, very, very easily, very, very, very quickly, and even in a kli sheni, those would cook. So what we come out with is, possibly on the doraita level, the kli sheni does it cook, and the answer is, depends. Okay, it's not a good place to stop. Let's carry on, because now we're at the cliffhanger. So we have here one of the Rishonim, Rabbi Eliezer Mimetz. Rabbi Eliezer Mimetz is a very, very significant voice in the Rishonim. He also wrote the Sefer Yereim, which is one of the Monei Mitzvot. We know we have different books amongst the Rishonim counting the 613 mitzvot. Everybody agrees, by the way, that we have more than 613 mitzvot. We have lots and lots of things that we have to do. The question is, how do you classify? There is a Gemara that says that there are Tariag mitzvot. We're coming up to Rosh Hashanah. Everybody knows, right? How many seeds does the pomegranate have? Absolutely not. Actually, once we were walking home from shul, and my son was very enthusiastic about counting all the seeds in the pomegranate, and he was sure there were 613. I said to Rabbi, why? And he said, "Don't tell him it's not. Let him think that that's fine." But it doesn't actually say, anyway, I'm sorry to disappoint you all. This is maybe more relevant for next week's show. I'm sorry to disappoint you all, but it does not say anywhere that there are 613 seeds in a pomegranate. What the Gemara does say is that just as a pomegranate is full of seeds, so too it is full of mitzvah. It says it's full. That's all. So you can have it. We did once, if you remember, on Tu B'Shvat, as we had to say that we had a video where somebody went through and took a pomegranate and counted all the seeds. I don't think they got to 613, but it's okay. It does not need to shatter your faith that there are less than 613 seeds in a pomegranate. Why did we start talking about that? I actually don't remember. Because we're talking about the array, and that's right. So we count the mitzvot. So there are more than 613 things, but it's a question of how you classify them, right? So the Rambam in his Sefer Mitzvot, we have Smag, and we have Smag, Sefer Mitzvot Kadosh, Sefer Mitzvot Kadam, Sefer Achilot, many different Monei Mitzvot. The Rambam, in his introduction to the Sefer Mitzvot, he gives his principles of how he counted what is included in the Taryag and what is not included in the Taryag. But there are certain things we have to do, as Paul mentioned yesterday. right? So we have certain super mitzvot according to the Rambam. So wherever you have a principle, which is an all-encompassing principle, which includes everything in the Torah, that's not included as one of the Tariag. You have to do it. For sure, you have to do it. Asita yashar v'atov b'nei Hashem. Right? The Torah says you have to do what is good and right in the eyes of Hashem. Is that one of the 613? Says the Rambam. No, it's too all-encompassing. There are those who explain that is why the Rambam did not include tshuva as a mitzvah. So what do you mean? Of course he does. Well, you're going to appeal for tshuva, right? The Rambam writes that there is one mitzvah taseh relating to tshuva, and that is the mitzvah of vidui. So there are those who say, according to Rambam, there's no mitzvah of tshuva. It's a mitzvah of vidui because tshuva is all-encompassing. There are those who understand Tzitzias and others, right? That according to the Rambam, the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael is all-encompassing. It's got everything, and that's why he didn't include it. There's a famous discussion of the Ramban and Megillat Esther. Okay, but that is the different ways of counting the mitzvot, and one of those fundamentals for him is the Sefer Yereim. That is Rabbi Eliezer Nimitz. So he writes the following over here, source number 39. He says, "Ein bishul taloi lo b'kli rishon v'lo b'kli sheni." Okay. Check out everything, forget everything that we've spoken about since the beginning of last week's year until now. Says the Sefer Yereim, it's all wrong. Okay? Cooking is not dependent on whether it's a kli rishon or whether it's a kli sheni. And we spoke last week about the difficulties conceptually between kli rishon and kli sheni. If it's the same temperature, it does the same thing, why does it matter? So he says, look, lefi shehu davar mitpashel. Sometimes you have a certain food, it's very soft, it cooks very easily. I don't care if you call it a kli rishon, you call it a kli sheni, you call it a magi, you call it whatever you want. But if it cooks, it cooks. Yesh davar kasher, sometimes you have a food which is very hard. Shafilu b'kli rishon eino mitpashel. And if it's a kli rishon, it doesn't cook. V'yesh davar mitpashel b'kli rishon v'lo b'kli sheni, and there are those things that cook in a kli rishon and a kli sheni. Okay. And he quotes about salt, what we said. Now in bold, he says, Ilkach, Yizahel Adam shelo lachnis b'Shabbat shum davar b'kli sheni v'af b'kli shlishi. We're going to get to kli shlishi. We'll see if there is such a concept. But Yereim is one of the first to mention it. He says, don't put anything into a kli sheni or a kli shlishi shayat soledet bo. I know what you're all thinking, what about a kli revi? Right? He says nowadays we are not experts on what is soft and what is hard and what can cook and what can't cook. It's always interesting. We have this concept comes up throughout halacha, many different areas that we say today. When do we say today? We are b'kiyim, we're not. In many cases, we spoke about earlier about Yad Soledet, Kazayit, etc. The Torah is given over in a way that will. How are you meant to judge things? Only based on what you can see. But nonetheless, certain poskim, certain cases we say, nowadays we don't know, we don't understand, and therefore we have to be machmir. So that's what the Yereim says. The Yereim says, look, kli rishon, kli sheni, I'm not interested. The question is, does it cook, does it not cook? I know from the Gemara that certain things can cook even in a kli sheni. Notwithstanding the fact that the Gemara says, and probably the most quoted line after my Ma'akonim Tova is a kli sheni and Omer Vashem, right? Notwithstanding that, but says the Yereim, look, there are certain foods that do cook in a kli sheni. I don't know what they are anymore. None of us know. So we have to assume that everything cooks. So kli sheni, according to the Yereim, basically has now become like a kli rishon. Okay, that's what comes out. But now the Yereim is one opinion. Not everybody's going to follow him. We'll see that's the Rishonim. We have to see Shulchan Aruch Ramah. How do we basket and how do we relate to this? So the Ramah, now it's a bit complicated because the Ramah over here talks about a couple of different stringencies together. He talks about this stringency, and he also talks about the stringency of Shulchan Aruch, of Bishul Achar Afiyah, which is something we're only going to get to in the next year. So hold that thought. But in any event, related to our question now, says the Ramah, Hu atin kol davar kasher, she'eno ra'oi le'achol klal belo shriya, de'asur lishoto b'shabbat avei gmar melacha. We are going to say, again, based on our Mishnah and based on the Yereim, that we assume any hard substance that cannot be eaten without soaking it in hot water, that it's going to be prohibited. And here says the Mishnah Berurah, what's he talking about? Afilu b'kli sheni. Okay, so at this point, based on the Ramah, we're going to say that any food, any uncooked food, to place it into a pot of boiling water, into a hot
whatever, that's Kli Sheni, is going to be forbidden. Says the Shema Shabbat Kilchata, source number 42. He says, Mikevan sheyesh lamachaneh pashlim gam bekli sheni, ve'en anachnu bakim ladat elohem. We don't know what they are. Yesh lachmir v'lamar shekol davar she'eino mvashal. We therefore have to say anything which is not cooked. Again, if we're dealing with cooked food, cooked is cooked. We said certainly with solids, ein bishul achar bishul. But any raw food we cannot place in a kli sheni. Yes, one mishum isul bishul gam ben tov bekli sheni. Imunav tashish bekli sheni ucham bishul she'at tzalei. Okay, so that is one way of looking at it, right? The Uraim, the Ramah seems to accept that we assume that everything is kalei bishul, unless we know otherwise, but we don't know otherwise. The Chazon Ish is not as much. The Chazon Ish says there are certain foods we know are kalei bishul, but there we can be strengthened, and other things we don't have to worry. Have a look at what he says in number 42. He's katav b'mishnah b'uha b'shem magen avam yesh lachmir b'kol davar she'en eto m'var b'gmar. Anything which okay, sorry, I actually forgot to mention. The Gemara does mention that mayim and shemen, the water and oil, are not considered kalei bishul. Okay, so there we aren't going to be stringent. But then he says now in bold, ein lachmir rak bepatam ra b'smag mishum shuk va'afui noach litpashav alo b'shal davar. When it comes to bread, we know that is kalei bishul. Also, it hasn't actually been cooked; it's been baked. So there we're going to be stringent. Omnam levashel beitza b'kli sheni sheyatz le'pavashu. He says eggs as well. An egg is something that you see that certainly very, very easily becomes cooked, and there we'd be stringent by a kli sheni. But everything else, food which does not very, very easily cook, he says we don't have to be stringent about that. It's from kalei bishul. That is the Chazon Ish, and Rav Ovadia similarly rules leniently over the page. He says. Just in bold, he says, Yesh chokim v'omrim she'en hivdel b'zemen kashim ra'akim. We don't distinguish in hard and soft foods. Shekulam einam mitpashlim b'kli sheni. Nothing cooks in a kli sheni. Ve'alacha k'rishon acharon. And that is how we paskin, says Rav Ovadia. Ashkenazim ra'agim nachmir kadei ha'rishonah. Right? The Ashkenazim, however, are more stringent. Okay, that is a kli sheni. Let's talk now about a kli shlishi. And then it's going to lead us on to discussion relating to tea and coffee. Right? Very, very important question. So regarding Kli Shlishi, now we do have Pri Megadim here, which talks about a Kli Shlishi. Source number 45. He says, Yosef Pat Kli Sheni. Right. Ha Kli Shlishi Batei V'chadome Shema'ale Mimayim Tmunim Kli Sheni Mishon Lekarot Tanim V'yesh Laker. Says the Pri Megadim. We find throughout halacha a discussion about a kli sheni. Why do we find discussion about a kli sheni specifically? Because it's a kli sheni and not a kli shlishi. A kli sheni sometimes cooks, but a kli shlishi would never cook. That is the source. Now we have a major machloket amongst the achronim, achronei zmanenu. The Chazon Ish says, what's a kli shlishi? It says the reason the Gemara doesn't talk about a kli shlishi is because there's no such thing as a kli shlishi. Right, you have a kli sheni, which is distinct from a kli rishon. Kli rishon is something because the kli rishon is on the fire. That's its distinct characteristic. So whether it's on the fire or off the fire, it's still the kli rishon. But once I've transferred it from the kli rishon, it's now a kli sheni. You could, I suppose, call it kli sheni and not a kli rishon. It's the Drasha and Shabbos. Those who are here, right? The kli sheni is always comparing itself to the one that came before. So that's. But he says everything is a kli sheni. There is no such thing. Kli sheni, kli shlishi, kli revi. I don't care. It's the same. It's the same distinction. He says lo matzinu in bold in source number 46. Lo matzinu makol lechalek ben sheni l'shlishi. What's the difference between 2 and 3? Im dvarim mitpashlim b'sheni, mitpashlim b'shlishi. If something is going to cook in a kli sheni, in other words, if something will cook in a pot that was not on the fire, it will cook in another pot that was not on the fire. It's the same thing. Ve'en hadavar talo yala b'chom hamayim yuchamim sheyat solel b'hem. So long as the water is at this temperature of Yad Soledepo, it will cook. So says the Chazon Ish. Comes along with Moshe Feinstein with a tshuva which changes the world. You know, there are certain tshuvot. We don't realize it nowadays. It's so accepted and so commonplace. But when he wrote this, it was completely revolutionary, right? And anybody who drinks tea from a tea bag on Shabbat can thank Rav Moshe Feinstein, right? Rav Moshe writes here in Shuti Grot Moshe. Something which is, again, nowadays, like I said, quite commonplace, quite prevalent, but it's a tremendous chiddush when he writes it. And he says, Unlike the Chazon Ish, because hang on, right? Kli Sheni, the Gemara talks about Kli Sheni, specifically a Kli Sheni. That's the one that can still cook. But beyond that, it would be different. He says, you want to say this Kalab Bishul that can cook in a Kli Sheni? Okay, but it will never cook in a Kli Shlishi. The lo matzinu ela shebakli sheni yesh dvarim hamitbashlim umimele ma'achar she'en anu yodim yesh le'asor kol davar ubakli shlishi lo matzinu. Even if we accept the Yerayim, right, and we say this Kalab Bishul, there are certain things which cook in a Kli Sheni. I don't know what they are, so I'm going to be machmir for everything. Because a Kli Shlishi, we don't have to be concerned. And the truth is that it makes sense when you realize that a Kli Sheni is probably a chumrah in the first place. We're saying we probably assume that the Kli Sheni does not cook, but because we don't know what it doesn't cook, we have to be machmir. Are we going to be even more machmir to say maybe it didn't cook, maybe it's a sveika, right? Maybe it didn't cook in the first place in a Kli Sheni in any event, and maybe there is such a thing as a Kli Shlishi, which is different. Anyway, so he is therefore lenient. So practical applications, again, the greatest practical application is going to be the case of making tea on Shabbat. But before we get there, let's see page 46, source 48, again, Yonchot Shabbat. So he said, Haposkim nechlaku, imutar yitain pusat limon al lemon is bad. Right? Can you take a piece of lemon and put it in your cup of tea, which is in a Kli Sheni? Figure out how you're going to make the tea in the Kli Sheni in the first place. Okay, but assuming you had, right, the Fiyam again, Abraham Mishnah Yesh le'asor. Because right now the question is, are you cooking the lemon when you put it in the Kli Sheni? So according to one opinion, we would say no. V'dat Chazon Ish. Remember, although the Chazon Ish was confusing, Chazon Ish was machmir to say that there's no difference between a Kli Sheni and a Kli Shlishi. But the Chazon Ish was mekel to say we don't have to assume that everything cooks in a Kli Sheni. So we say latir. Imamayim einam chamim b'shur sheyad nichveit bo. Yad nichveit bo is a different measure. It's high. It's more than yad soledet bo. We'll get there. But b'kli shleishi yesh lakel b'chen adin b'alei nana. So lemon or mint leaves, to put them in a kli shlishi, we would say that you could be making. Mutar litein chalav mufustar letoch kli sheni me'ena yad nichveit bo. Again, if it's not really boiling hot, pasteurized milk, because that is considered cooked. We could say there you could put it in the Kli Sheni. Again, you asked me what about Bishul Achal Bishul? We saw that as well a chumrah. We don't add so many chumras together. Okay, Mem Zayin says Yesh lakel litein avkat kafeh names b'kli shitbashel b'shat hayitzur b'kli sheni. Okay, it comes to coffee, instant coffee. Again, a lot of these things get complicated because there are all different types and all different makes and all different manufacturing processes nowadays. But assuming that it's a plain, ordinary instant coffee which has been roasted, which has been cooked by the time it gets to you. So to place that into a Kli Sheni, and again, what do we mean by placing a Kli Sheni? We mean you already have the water in the Kli Sheni, and then you're putting in the coffee powder. If you have the coffee powder in the cup first, and then you're pouring the water, that's not Kli Sheni, that's called Irui, and that's a different question. But we're saying if you have it in a Kli Sheni, so if it is instant coffee powder, which is already cooked, that would be permitted. There are those that are more stringent, say a Kli Shlishi. You can see in the footnote here, number 33, there's a whole discussion, right? If it's the flavored coffee, if it's the vanilla, if it's the hazelnut, I don't know. I don't drink coffee, so I don't know. But some of these coffees nowadays are not cooked, and that would certainly be a problem. But then you would have to wait for the Kli Shlishi. But assuming that it's cooked, then the Kli Sheni would be okay. Now, Memchet, Nireh Shedin Dvash Kedin Pusat Limona Miskar Le'el. It would seem the honey would be the same as the lemon, right? Which was, we said, was a machloket in a Kli Sheni, but in a Kli Shlishi would be okay. And finally, mutar latek mayim biltim vushalim letoch Kli Sheni velo gazu b'zeh mishum d'nemekim basham. To add a little bit, okay, that gets into a whole different discussion as well, but a little bit of cold uncooked water into a Kli Sheni, we said that does not look like Mitzvakim Basham. Have a look at source number 49. Yeah. Is that if that's the way that's making the food, we're not concerned for them. We'll get to tzoveh a little bit later on, but we don't say tzoveh about food. We're not concerned. Okay, so Pnei Halacha number 49 is an interesting discussion over here. What about a manach chama? right? Manachama, there were those that say that you probably shouldn't eat them any day of the week. But if, let's say on Shabbat, could you cook one of these? You know, you have these parts of, you know, the instant noodles or instant soup or whatever it is. So he says, mutar lachin manachama shamarako orez. If we're dealing with soup or rice or pasta, see in a moment why he says that. If you pour from a kli sheni, again, when I'm dealing with irui, when I'm dealing with pouring, it can't be any worse than the kli that I'm pouring from. So irui from a kli sheni, that's like kli sheni. Shakli sheboy nimtzeti kli he kli shlishi. The manachama pot would be the kli shlishi. The en chashash beirui mikli sheni or below yadua shamanachama mikalei abishur. Right, so he says practically we don't says here like the Chazon Ish. We don't assume that the Menachema is like the Kalei Bishul. Aval Pile, right, mashed potato, those ones you could not. That is asur lachin mishum nisha. Then you have a problem of lash, of kneading, which is a different malacha. Now have a look at number 50, just in English. This is from the OU kosher website. The question was asked on Shabbos, may I prepare a cup of noodles from the instant soup by pouring hot water from an urn onto it? So they say here, unlike regular pasta, which is still raw, instant soup noodles are fully cooked. The reason they are hard and brittle is because they are dehydrated and can be rehydrated simply by soaking them in warm water. Right, and therefore, they say sometimes though they are not cooked because they're cooked with steam, and that's a different process than cooking with water, which is a different question. However, in bold, Mishnah Berurah writes it's permissible to place bread into a kli shlishi. The same would apply here as well. So we note that the flavor packets that come into soup may contain uncooked spices and dehydrated vegetables that are not fully cooked. Okay, so the packet, that's an important point. There are elements here which are uncooked, but we assume here that the kli shlishi, that would be okay in terms of that. All right, so these are some of the practical applications and the differences between kli sheni and kli shlishi. Let's look at the question now of tea, because making tea on Shabbat. So again, it's going to depend on two things which we've already seen. Sorry, yeah. Right, so the question is, but we say if it has been, the question is this, if it has, right now, you're right, no one's going to eat it that way, but if it's already been cooked and dehydrated, then the question is, that's what we're saying. Throughout these halachot, the question is the same as we asked the question, what's the difference between Kli Rishon and Kli Sheni? Same as when we asked the question, what's the difference between Kli Sheni and Kli Shlishi, right? Is there a difference in reality? When I look at my Kli Rishon or I look at my Kli Sheni, it looks exactly the same. Right? I put whatever it is inside. Here it looks like it's cooking. Here it looks like it's cooking. But we say that halachically there's a difference. So there's a tension here throughout. Do I say that there is a halachic difference, or do I say that there is a difference in reality? Right? That's the question that we're grappling with throughout. So the poskim say, yeah, when it comes to manachama, you're right. Right now, I'm not going to eat it. But we say that if we're using the kli shlishi and the way that it's done, that would be, again, seemingly according to the Chazon Ish would say that if it's not cooked, it's a kli sheni, it's the same as the kli shlishi, maybe you would say that you cannot use it. And for that reason, if you want to be machmer, there's what to be machmer on, but these also say that you can do it. Okay. All right, let's talk about tea. Well, look, let's talk about, so there you're probably going to have a question of Lisha as well and things like that. But let's talk about tea and coffee, the same thing. Tea, coffee powder. Nobody's going to drink the coffee, eat the coffee powder as it is, right? But nonetheless, what we say, that's the point. It's been cooked before, so it's not considered halachic cooking. There is actually one individual I know who used to eat the coffee by itself. This is a legendary story that went around in Shabbat Kota. But Nevinso, many years ago, was told by, I've heard the story from two different sources, but Nevinso, the rabbi of the old city. Anybody knows, there are certain people that are just on a different level. There was a video clip that went around a few years ago he was in a light car accident, he was fine, but you saw that actually, remember, so I was sitting in the car, there'd been an accident or whatever it was. He's sitting there with this Gemara, he doesn't even know what's happened. That's the level of his Mada. So he didn't sleep very much, and he didn't sleep very much. The doctor told him he needed to drink coffee for his health. And I heard this from two different rabbis in the yeshiva who used to work with him, that they saw him take a spoon of coffee and swallow the spoon and drink the water. And they said to him, why don't you, what are you doing? He said, doctor told me I have to drink coffee. They said, why don't you make a cup of coffee? And he said, I don't have time. Can you imagine? I don't have time. Can you imagine living your life in such a way? Most people are unable to do this. But now it's also is a very, very holy person, a very, very special individual. He doesn't have those few seconds when the amount that he could be learning then to make a cup of coffee. Okay, but most people aren't like that. Most people want to drink the coffee, they're going to put it in the hot water, etc. But so you wouldn't drink the coffee powder, but we consider it to be cooked. And therefore, if it's in the klisheni, it'll be okay, or the klish lishi. Now, what about tea? Tea is more problematic because, have a look at the Aruch HaShulchan, source number 51. It says, okay, we said that there is such a concept of things which cook easily. Now, this herb, which is called tea leaves, you pour over these leaves hot water, right? And it doesn't take much, it's very, very easy for it to cook. Okay, that goes back to the discussion, right? Or we are Bakian, says the Aruch HaShulchan. How do we know that it cooks, that it's from Kalei Bishul? Because you can see, even if it's in a Kli Sheni, you see what's the proof? You see that the water changes color. He says that is Isul Doraita, that is cooking. Rabim Nichshalim Bazeh B'tanot Shel Hefer. Many are misled by baseless claims of this. So there you see, the Aruch HaShulchan says, I don't care if it's a Kli Sheni, it's a Kli Shlishi, you've got the tea leaves, you're cooking, you can see that it cooks, it's cooking, don't tell me stories. Now, Rav Moshe Feinstein disagrees. Rav Moshe Feinstein, who was Machadesh for us, that there's a difference between Kli Sheni and Kli Shlishi. He says the following, source number 52, he says, Basiatam, Elarak Miubashim B'chum, in other words, the tea leaves that you buy in the shop, these have not been cooked. So he says, right? As we said, I think this is the same shuvah that we quoted before. Right? It's been printed again, but with a continuation. Says Rav Moshe Feinstein, there is no such thing as bishul and kli shlishi. It does not exist. Over the page, 49. He says, your eyes can mislead you, right? That which you think you see, that tea cooks, gam b'kli shlishi, lo muvan zeh, ma shelo inanu b'einenu, shemitadmin hamayim, you see the water changes color, that's not cooking. Af b'kalim hamash mitadmin, b'meshach zman. If you leave the tea bag in cold water for long enough, it'll also change color. And that's not tea. Of course, again, b'chamin she'enayam tzaledet, v'lo zeh inyan b'shul. That is not the definition of cooking, and therefore, there's Rav Moshe Feinstein. Again, this is coming after the Mishnah Berurah. Mishnah Berurah has pages and pages and pages about how to make tea on Shabbat, to use the tea essence and it's liquid and it's sort of recently sharing a whole massive discussion. I'm not going to go into all of it now. We've brought some of the excerpts in here. But says Rav Moshe Feinstein, you don't have to worry about the tea essence. You go to a kli shlishi, you pour your water into a kli shlishi, you put the tea bag in. V'shalom Yisrael. So as I said, anybody who drinks tea from a tea bag on Shabbat has Rav Moshe Feinstein to thank. If you hold like the Chazon Ish, who says there is no difference between the Kli Sheni and the Kli Shlishi, or Revi or Chamishi or Shishi or Shri or whatever you want, then you're going to have a problem. Then you will not be able to use the tea bags, and then you would have to make the tea essence and do the whole thing that way. So the Or Letzion, which is Rav Ben Zion Abba Shaul, he also says here, source number 53, Aim mutar lasim sakiyot teh b'kos mayim chon Shabbat, mutar lasim sakiyot teh v'chen alei teh b'kli shlishi, because you can put the tea in a kli shlishi, שיש בו מים חמים שאת צוללת בהם, וכן מותר להראות מכלי שני על שקית תה. Same thing he also says, now that's interesting. He says that you could pour from a kli sheni onto the tea bag. Why does he say that? So he said that pouring, we consider it to be mevashel klipa, cooks the outer layer. So what's the outer layer? The outer layer is the bag, not the actual tea inside. And therefore he says, okay, that is a bit more contentious. Not everybody agrees with that, but just as not everybody agrees with the other heter. But in any event, that's that. Now the Mishnah Berurah was not happy about this whole idea with the tea bags. He has a different approach, and as I mentioned, he talks about making tea essence that you should have from before Shabbat. Have a look at source number 55. He says in Ofen Zeh Sheba'alnu Nafshenu Chaper Noagim. B'mikom Makom כתבו האחרונים עצה המובחרת מזה, דהיינו שיתקן essence מערב שבת לגמרי. You should prepare the tea essence by soaking the leaves in hot water before Shabbat, שלא יצטרך להראות לתוכו עוד רותחין למחר בשבת, that you won't have to pour hot water onto the essence on Shabbat, ולמחר שיצטרך לשתות, ייתן האסנס הצונן לתוך הכוס ששותה בו, אחר שהוא המים חמים לתוכו ונעשה כלי שני. But after you pour the hot water into the kli sheni and then you add the tea essence, that is how he suggests to make the tea. Interesting is that Rav Soloveitchik also has quite a leniency here when it comes to making tea, because he says that like Rav Moshe Feinstein, he doesn't believe that the tea leaves are kalei bishul at all. Have a look in source number 56. This is Nefesh Harav, which is a collection of hanagot and opinions of Rav Soloveitchik, which is written by Rav Shachta. He writes, במשנה ברורה הביאה כמה מן האחרונים להחמיר שלא לעשות תה אפילו בכלי שני, ורבינו נזכיר לא רבי נחמן, רבינו here is also רבי צ'ק, רבינו אמר בזה הלשון, שהסבא שלו, Soloveitchik's grandfather, right, who was Chaim, שהסבא שלו היה מדקדק במצווה, he was pretty firm, והיה משתמש בשקיות תה בכלי שני, he would use tea bags in a כלי שני, ואף הוא היה נוהג אחריו להכיר בזה גם כן. And Rav Soloveitchik was also lenient about this. Okay, you can see a little bit more about that in the footnotes here. There's an interesting, I just mentioned one more point, in footnote number 45, just to go back to this distinction between Kli Sheni and Kli Shlishi and others, Rav Willig has an interesting point of view. Rav Willig is also Rosh NYU. He says, okay, he's a little bit more machmir. And he says for the following reason. He says that even if one is lenient with respect to cooking in a kli shlishi, this should not be relied upon when kli shlishi is sometimes used as the normal method of preparing the food. So when you make tea, when you have the hot water, which is in the kettle, which is a kli rishon, it's poured into a pitcher, and a kli sheni, it's poured into a cup, it's a kli shlishi. If that's the normal way that it's done, maybe there's something artificial about this transfer from kli sheni to kli shlishi. Okay, but that's a unique point. But to summarize, and this will end. What we said is the following. Kli sheni and Omer Vasher. The kli sheni, generally speaking, we say does not cook. We are concerned that it looks like cooking. That's michzik and Vasher. And furthermore, we are concerned about kalei habishul. We learn from the Gemara, both from the Mishnah talking about the fish and from the case about the salt, that there are cases in which you have food which it cooks very, very easily. The question is, do we need to be concerned that all foods we should look at as if perhaps they cook very, very easily in a kli sheni? So that is a chumrah. That is the chumrah of the Sefer Yereim, Rabbi Eliezer Mimitz. The Ramah says it is appropriate to follow this chumrah, and therefore any uncooked food, when it's cooked food we can place our kli sheni, but it's uncooked food that we cannot put into the kli sheni because we are worried that it might be kalei habishul. The Chazon Ish said we don't need to be concerned about everything that it is from the kalei habishul, and therefore we could put it in a kli sheni. The Chazon Ish who said that was machmir on a different matter. He said there is no such thing as a kli shlishi. But Moshe Feinstein said there is such a thing as a kli shlishi. Nothing ever cooks in a kli shlishi, and therefore, according to Moshe Feinstein, you put your tea bag into your kli shlishi. As we saw, others were a bit machmir, but that is behind all the discussions about making tea and coffee on Shabbat. A lot more to say, but we'll end it for there. So as I said at the beginning, next week, B'ezrat Hashem, please join us. We'll be discussing Rosh Hashanah, Yamim No'im, and everybody have a good week. Everyone, okay.